Take this bowl and go beg. The billionaire's fiancée humiliated the maid. Then the billionaire did something no one expected. The silver bowl hit the marble floor with a sound sharper than any scream. 200 guests froze mid-sip, crystal glasses hovering in the golden light of the ballroom chandeliers. A woman in a canary yellow gown stood with her arms still extended, her manicured fingers trembling with fury, her voice ringing off walls draped in white roses. Take this bowl and go beg, since that's clearly all you're good for. On her knees before 300 of Greenwich's wealthiest families knelt a woman in a maid's uniform, her hands pressed together, her eyes brimming with tears she refused to let fall. 30 years old. Steady hands that had never once shaken while carrying trays through this house, shaking now. Behind her, a 6-year-old girl's voice cracked through the silence. "Mommy, get up. Please get up." And standing 3 feet away, close enough to stop it, close enough to have stopped it 30 seconds earlier, was the man whose name was on every deed, every account, every headline in that room. 45 years old. A man who had built an empire from nothing. A man everyone assumed would say something. He said nothing. Not yet. His jaw was locked, his hands curled into fists at his sides, and something in his eyes had gone very, very still. The particular stillness of a man doing math he'd been avoiding for months. No one in that ballroom knew that within 7 days, this single moment, this bowl, this floor, this kneeling woman, would end an engagement, expose a lie 4 years in the making, and change the entire trajectory of 3 lives forever. But first, you need to understand how a devoted mother ended up on her knees in front of the only man who could have stopped it. Her name was Elena Cruz, and 6 months earlier she had walked into the Hale estate believing it was simply a job, the best-paying job she'd ever been offered, the one that would finally let her move her daughter into a real school with a real playground instead of the cracked asphalt lot behind their apartment building. She hadn't come looking for anything more than a paycheck. She certainly hadn't come looking for Daniel Hale's attention, or his trust, or the quiet way his entire household had begun, without anyone quite noticing, to run a little more gently since she'd arrived. She had no idea that the woman wearing his ring had already decided Elena needed to disappear. And she had absolutely no idea how far that woman was willing to go to make it happen. 6 months before the ballroom, before the bowl, before any of it, Elena's alarm went off at 5:15 in the morning in a 2-bedroom apartment in Stamford that smelled like the lavender detergent she bought because it was on sale. She'd wake before Sophia, brew coffee she'd drink lukewarm on the drive, and lay out her daughter's clothes on the small chair by the window. The blue dress on Tuesdays, because Tuesday was library day and Sophia liked to feel fancy for the books. 3 years earlier, Elena's husband Marco had died in a warehouse accident that the company's insurance had fought for 11 months before finally, grudgingly, settling for far less than it should have. Elena had spent those 11 months working 2 jobs and learning, in the quiet hours after Sophia fell asleep, exactly how alone a person could feel while still being someone's entire world. She never spoke about it at work. She didn't believe in burdening people with her grief. She believed, the way her mother had taught her, that dignity wasn't loud. It was in how you folded a towel. How you looked someone in the eye. How you showed up every single day, even on the days it cost you everything you had left. The job at the Hale estate had come through a woman at her church, a former housekeeper there who'd retired to care for her grandchildren. "It's a good house," the woman told her. "Mr. Hale barely notices the staff, which is a kindness in its own way. Just do your work and go home to that beautiful girl of yours." Elena had taken the job seriously in a way that surprised even the head housekeeper, Mrs. Whitcomb, who'd seen dozens of employees pass through in 15 years. Elena arrived early. She noticed things, that Daniel Hale's mother, who lived in the East Wing recovering from a stroke, preferred her tea a specific shade of amber, that she lit up when someone simply sat with her for 10 minutes instead of rushing through her room like a checklist. Elena started sitting with her. Not because it was required. Because Mrs. Hale reminded her, in small ways, of her own mother, gone 8 years now. Daniel noticed. He never said much, a nod in the hallway, a quiet thank you when he found his mother laughing at something Elena had said. But 3 weeks in, Mrs. Whitcomb pulled Elena aside. "He asked me who you were," she said. "Mr. Hale doesn't usually ask." Elena hadn't thought much of it. She wasn't there to be noticed. She was there so that in September, Sophia could start at Brookfield Elementary, the school with the reading garden and the after-school art program, the one 3 towns over from anything Elena had ever been able to afford before. She kept a small jar on top of the refrigerator at home, and every Friday she'd fold 2 $20 bills into it. Sophia had started calling it the garden jar, because she'd overheard Elena explaining what the money was for. "How much more, Mommy?" Sophia would ask, climbing onto a kitchen chair to peer at it. "Getting closer, Mija. Getting closer." She had no idea that in the east wing of a mansion she cleaned 5 days a week, a woman in a diamond the size of a robin's egg had already begun asking pointed questions about the help, and that dignity, the quiet and showy kind Elena had built her whole life around, was about to be tested in front of everyone she had ever tried to protect it from. Vanessa Kingsley arrived at the Hale estate the way she arrived everywhere, like the room owed her something for the privilege of holding her. She was 34, striking in the deliberate, engineered way of someone who had spent considerable money ensuring it looked effortless, and she had been engaged to Daniel for 8 months when Elena first felt the shift in the air whenever Vanessa entered a room. It started small. A criticism about how the roses were arranged. "Did no one teach you asymmetry is vulgar?" Aimed at Elena, though the flowers weren't even her responsibility. A comment about Elena's accent, delivered with a laugh that invited the room to laugh along, though no one did. Then it stopped being small. 3 weeks before the engagement gala, Vanessa summoned Elena to the drawing room under the pretense of discussing table linens for an upcoming dinner. Elena arrived to find Vanessa standing beside an antique vase, a Ming-era piece, Daniel's late father had once told the staff, worth more than most people's homes, now lying in 3 pieces on the Persian rug. "You knocked this over yesterday," Vanessa said, before Elena had even fully entered the room. "I saw you dusting in here." "I wasn't in this room yesterday. I was assigned to the kitchen wing." "Are you calling me a liar?" Elena felt the floor tilt slightly beneath her, the particular vertigo of realizing a trap has already closed. "No, I'm only saying I wasn't here." "Mrs. Whitcomb will confirm the schedule," Vanessa said, "but accidents happen, and I'd hate for this to become a formal matter. Unless, of course, you'd like to pay for it out of your wages. It would only take—" She tilted her head, calculating with visible pleasure. "About 4 years, I'd imagine, at what Daniel pays you." Elena said nothing. Her hands, folded in front of her apron, had gone white at the knuckles. Mrs. Whitcomb, when consulted later that day, confirmed without hesitation that Elena had been in the kitchen wing at the time in question. 3 other staff members corroborated it. The matter, on paper, was closed. But something had shifted, and Elena understood, with the clear-eyed instinct of someone who had survived worse, that it wasn't really about the vase at all. That night, tucking Sophia in, Elena sat a long moment on the edge of the bed after the lights went out. "Mommy." Sophia's small voice came out of the dark. "Are you sad?" "No, Mija. Just thinking." "About the garden jar." Elena smiled despite herself, smoothing her daughter's hair back from her forehead. "About a lot of things." What she was actually thinking about was the particular look on Vanessa Kingsley's face when the vase story had failed to stick, not disappointment, not embarrassment. Calculation. The look of someone recalculating a plan, not abandoning it. Elena didn't know yet that she'd become a problem Vanessa intended to solve permanently. She only knew, lying awake long after Sophia's breathing had evened into sleep, that something in that house had turned against her, and that she had no power to stop it, only the choice of how she'd carry herself when it came. The following weeks brought a slow, deliberate tightening, the kind designed to look like nothing at all if anyone were watching closely, and no one was, because Daniel Hale was 3 continents deep in a merger that consumed 16 hours of every day, and Vanessa made certain her cruelty only surfaced when he wasn't in the room to witness it. Elena's hours were quietly rearranged, so she worked split shifts that made picking Sophia up from the after-school program nearly impossible 3 days a week. When she asked Mrs. Whitcomb about it, she was told, apologetically, that Miss Kingsley requested the change herself for the dinner preparations. Her pay, oddly, arrived 4 days late one month, an administrative error, the accounting office claimed, though Elena noticed it happened the week after she'd quietly declined to lie to a guest on Vanessa's behalf about a missing bracelet Vanessa herself had misplaced. Then came the letter. It arrived at Brookfield Elementary, addressed to the admissions office, unsigned, claiming, falsely, viciously, that the family applying for the fall term had provided fraudulent income documentation to qualify for the sliding scale tuition assistance Elena had spent 4 months securing. The school, obligated to investigate, froze Sophia's enrollment pending review. Elena found out on a Tuesday, standing in the school's front office, Sophia's small hand in hers, while an administrator explained with visible discomfort that concerns had been raised and they'd need updated documentation before September could proceed. She didn't cry in front of Sophia. She smiled, told her daughter it was just paperwork, bought her a mango popsicle from the corner store on the walk to the bus stop, and cried instead in the stairwell of the Hale Estate staff entrance 20 minutes before her shift, silently, efficiently, the way she'd learned to grieve everything, quickly, privately, and then back to work. She had no proof it was Vanessa. She had only the sick certainty in her stomach, the same certainty that told her the vase incident hadn't been random either. That Thursday, gathering the courage of someone with nothing left to lose but everything left to protect, Elena asked to speak with Mr. Hale directly. Not about Vanessa, she told herself, just to ask, carefully, whether there was anyone at the estate who might write a character reference for Sophia's school, given the sudden confusion with the paperwork. She waited 40 minutes outside his study. When his assistant finally emerged, she was told Mr. Hale was overseas until the following week and all requests should go through Mrs. Whitcomb. Elena went home that night, opened the garden jar, and counted what was there, enough, barely, for 1 more month of the after-school program, nothing left over for a lawyer, nothing left over for anything but survival. Sophia found her at the kitchen table near midnight. "Mommy, why are you still up?" Elena wiped her face quickly, pulled her daughter into her lap even though Sophia was getting too big for it, and held her the way you hold something you're terrified of losing. "Just tired, Mija. Go on back to bed." But sleep didn't come. Elena lay awake calculating, the way she'd calculated everything since Marco died, how many shifts, how many favors, how much of herself she had left to give before there was nothing left to protect Sophia with at all. She didn't know yet that the woman dismantling her life piece by piece was about to make one final, spectacular mistake, in front of the one person whose opinion could undo everything. The engagement gala was the largest event the Hale estate had hosted in a decade, 300 guests, a string quartet flown in from Vienna, enough white roses to fill a greenhouse, and Vanessa Kingsley at the absolute, blinding center of it, radiant in yellow silk, accepting congratulations like a queen accepting tribute. Elena had been assigned to the service staff for the evening, moving trays of champagne through rooms glittering with people who would never remember her face. She kept her head down, her steps quick and quiet, the way she always did, invisible, efficient, safe. She should have known safety was never guaranteed in that house. It happened during the toasts. A guest, an elderly relative of Vanessa's, unsteady on his feet, reached for a canapé from Elena's tray and, in doing so, knocked the entire tray from her hands. Cream sauce splattered across the hem of Vanessa's gown. The room's laughter died instantly. Vanessa turned, and Elena watched something in her face open up like a door she'd been waiting months to walk through. "You absolutely useless woman." Vanessa's voice carried, pitched precisely for an audience. "Do you know what this dress cost? Do you know what anything in this house costs, or are you simply incapable of understanding the difference between people like us and people like you?" "I'm so sorry, it was an accident, Neil." The single word landed like a slap. A few guests actually gasped. Elena hesitated, and in that hesitation Vanessa's hand shot out and closed around her wrist, forcing her downward with a strength born entirely of humiliation-fueled rage. Elena's knees hit the marble. Someone, a caterer, panicking, thrust a stainless mixing bowl of leftover food scraps toward Vanessa, thinking somehow to help clean the mess. Vanessa seized it instead as a weapon. "Take this bowl and go beg, since that's clearly all you're good for." The bowl clattered to the floor beside Elena's knees. Somewhere in the crowd, a small voice cried out. Sophia, who'd been allowed to wait quietly by the kitchen door for her mother's shift to end, now pushing through legs and gowns toward the center of the room. "Mommy, get up. Please get up." Elena's entire body went cold with a shame so complete it felt like drowning. Not for herself, she could bear anything for herself, but for the fact that her daughter, her bright, gentle 6-year-old, was watching her mother forced to her knees in front of strangers like something less than human. 3 feet away, Daniel Hale stood frozen. He had walked in during the second half of the sentence, close enough to have stopped the first half entirely if he'd moved a second sooner. Now he stood locked in place, his jaw tight, his hands curled at his sides, staring at the scene with an expression none of the guests could quite read. Shock, yes, but something harder underneath it, something calculating with terrible speed. Elena looked up once, just once, and met his eyes. She didn't ask him for anything. She had learned long ago that asking rarely worked in her favor. She simply looked at him, tears finally spilling despite everything, and in that single look was every unfair thing that had happened to her in 6 months, every quiet cruelty she'd absorbed without complaint, every ounce of dignity she'd fought to keep intact now shattered on a marble floor in front of the man who could have stopped it and hadn't. Then she looked away, gathered Sophia into her arms, and walked out of that ballroom in front of 300 people, her back straight, her steps steady, refusing to run even though every instinct screamed at her to. She had no idea Daniel Hale hadn't moved because he was still doing the math, the terrible, overdue math of exactly who he had let into his home and exactly what it had cost the one person in it who deserved better than anyone he'd ever met. Daniel found Elena 40 minutes later in the small staff break room off the kitchen, sitting with Sophia asleep against her shoulder, her uniform still stained, her eyes red but dry now, staring at nothing. He knocked softly on the open door, the first time in 6 months he'd ever knocked before entering a room in his own house. "I'm not here to apologize," he said quietly, and Elena's expression hardened, ready to hear whatever excuse came next. "I'm here because an apology isn't enough, and I don't want to insult you by pretending it is." Elena said nothing, exhaustion and hurt both too large for words. "I froze," he continued. "There's no excuse for it. I've spent 30 seconds since it happened trying to find one, and there isn't one. I watched a woman I employ kneel on my own floor and I did nothing, and I will carry that for a long time." "You don't have to carry anything," Elena said finally, her voice flat with fatigue. "I'll clean out my locker in the morning." "No," Daniel said, sharper than he intended. "You won't." Something in his tone made her look up. "I need you to know something," he said, sitting down slowly across from her, careful not to wake Sophia. "This isn't the first strange thing that's happened in this house in 6 months. The vase. The scheduling. I didn't put it together until tonight. Watching her face when she grabbed that bowl, I've seen that look before. Not at you. At my mother's nurse, 3 years ago, right before that woman quit without warning, and I never understood why." Elena's eyes sharpened despite herself. "I'm going to find out exactly what's been happening," Daniel said. "Not to protect my own name. To protect yours. But I need to ask you something first, and I need the truth, no matter how it makes me look." Elena waited. "Has this been going on longer than tonight?" For a long moment, Elena said nothing, weighing 6 months of silence against the cost of speaking now. Then, quietly, she told him. The vase. The shifted hours. The letter to Sophia's school that had frozen her daughter's enrollment 2 weeks before the semester began. Daniel's face went very still as she spoke, the particular stillness of a man filing away every detail for later use. "The school," he said when she finished. "Give me the name. Tomorrow morning." "Why?" Because whatever was done to stop your daughter from starting school in September is going to be undone by lunchtime, and then I'm going to find out exactly what else has been done that I don't yet know about." Elena studied him carefully, unwilling to trust easily after everything, but something in his face, the same stillness she'd seen across the ballroom, now aimed in an entirely different direction, told her this wasn't performance. "Why does it matter to you?" she asked finally. "I'm staff. I clean your floors." Daniel was quiet a long moment, looking not at her but at Sophia, sleeping peacefully against her mother's shoulder, utterly unaware of the storm around her. "Because for 6 months," he said slowly, "this house has felt different when you're in it. Kinda. My mother laughs more. The staff seems less afraid to make small mistakes. I didn't understand why until tonight, watching what happened when someone tried to take that away." He met her eyes. "You don't clean my floors, Ms. Cruz. You've been holding this house together, and I let someone humiliate you for it in front of everyone I know." Elena said nothing, but something in her chest, some tightly held, protective thing she'd carried since Marco died, loosened, just slightly, for the first time in longer than she could remember. She had no idea that within a week, the careful, quiet investigation Daniel Hale was about to launch would unravel a lie 4 years deep, and that the woman who had forced her to her knees was about to lose everything she'd spent those 4 years building. The next morning, before the sun had fully cleared the trees along the estate's long drive, Daniel called Sophia's school personally. By 9 a.m., the anonymous letter's claims had been formally withdrawn, Sophia's enrollment reinstated, and the tuition assistance Elena had spent months securing fully restored, along with a personal apology from the school's director, mortified to learn the complaint had been unfounded and malicious. But Daniel didn't stop there. He hired a private investigator, quietly, discreetly, telling no one at the estate, not even Mrs. Whitcomb, to trace the source of the letter, the timing of the pay error, the mysterious rescheduling of Elena's hours. He requested security footage from the drawing room the day of the broken vase. He began, for the first time in his adult life, paying attention to a house he had spent years treating as background noise to his empire. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't fast. The investigator hit dead ends. The letter had been mailed from a public post office with no return address, no fingerprints, nothing definitively tying it to anyone. Daniel spent long nights in his study poring over documents, increasingly frustrated, increasingly certain and unable to prove it. Elena, for her part, didn't wait passively for rescue. She'd never waited passively for anything. She went back to work the next day, chin up, saying nothing to her co-workers about what had happened, absorbing the whispered sympathy and the careful, awkward glances with the same quiet dignity she'd carried her whole life. Vanessa, sensing something had shifted but unable to name it, grew colder, more careful, more controlled around Elena. No more public scenes, but a simmering, watchful hostility that made the air in every room she entered feel thinner. Slowly, carefully, something else began growing alongside the investigation. An unlikely friendship between Daniel and Elena, built in small moments neither of them planned. He began stopping by his mother's room in the evenings, where Elena was often still sitting after her shift technically ended, and the three of them would talk, about nothing important, about books, about Sophia's drawings, which Mrs. Hale had begun taping to the wall beside her bed. "You're different around her," his mother told him one evening after Elena had left for the night, her stroke-slowed speech still sharp with observation. "You listen more. She sees things other people don't bother to see," Daniel admitted. Sophia, too, began warming to him in small, unguarded ways, showing him her drawings, asking him increasingly complicated questions about how skyscrapers didn't fall down, once falling asleep on the library sofa during a rainstorm with her head against his arm while Elena finished a late task nearby, too polite to interrupt and too moved to look away. Elena noticed the shift and fought it, at first. She'd learned the hard way that trusting powerful people rarely ended well for women in her position. But Daniel's consistency, small, unglamorous, daily consistency, began to wear down the wall she'd built. He remembered Sophia's school project deadlines. He quietly ensured Elena's hours were fixed and fair going forward, personally reviewing the schedule himself. He never once, in all those weeks, asked her for anything in return. "You don't have to keep proving something to me," Elena told him one evening, nearly 2 weeks after the gala, finding him still in his study past midnight, surrounded by files. "I'm not proving it to you," he said, not looking up. "I'm proving it to myself. I let this happen because I stopped paying attention to my own house a long time ago. I'm done doing that." It was the following Thursday, nearly 3 weeks after the ballroom, that the investigator finally called with something real, a name, a paper trail, and a discovery about Vanessa Kingsley far larger and far darker than a broken vase or a cruel word to a maid. The investigator's report arrived in a plain manila envelope, and Daniel read it twice before he trusted himself to believe it. Vanessa Kingsley's family fortune, the one she'd built her entire public identity around, the old money Connecticut name she'd traded on for years, had collapsed nearly 4 years earlier. Her father's investment firm had folded amid a string of failed ventures, leaving the family not simply reduced but deeply, catastrophically in debt. The Kingsley estate Vanessa still claimed as her childhood home had been sold in a private transaction 2 years prior. She'd been renting an apartment under a shell company ever since, maintaining the appearance of wealth entirely on borrowed money and calculated deception. Daniel Hale wasn't a fiancé to Vanessa Kingsley. He was, in the coldest possible terms, a rescue plan. Worse still, security footage the investigator had legally obtained from a supplier's delivery camera near the drawing room showed Vanessa herself, 3 weeks before accusing Elena, deliberately shifting the antique vase to the edge of a shelf, staging an accident she could later pin on someone else, apparently as an early, discarded attempt to have Elena dismissed before escalating to more damaging tactics. And buried in a folder of financial records, almost incidental compared to everything else, was proof that the anonymous letter to Sophia's school had been mailed from a post office 2 blocks from Vanessa's regular hair salon. On a day her salon appointment records confirmed she'd been in that exact neighborhood. Daniel sat with the folder for nearly an hour before he found the final document, one the investigator had flagged separately, almost apologetically, as unrelated to the original request, but you'll want to see it. Text messages, recovered from a discarded phone Vanessa had sold to a second-hand shop without properly wiping it, revealed months of correspondence with a man named Preston Cole, Daniel's own longtime friend and occasional business associate. The messages left no room for interpretation. Vanessa had been planning, in her own words, to lock down the marriage before Preston's own fortune, which she considered the more attractive prize, became available following his impending divorce. "Once the ring's on and the prenup signed, I just have to wait him out," one message read. "His predictable. Boring, but predictable. Should be easy money once I'm his wife." Daniel read that sentence more times than he wanted to admit. It wasn't the affair that hollowed him out, not really. He'd suspected, on some buried level, that Vanessa's affection had always carried the faint metallic taste of transaction. It was the casualness. The sheer, breezy contempt with which she'd planned to dismantle his life for money she'd then planned to extract even further, all while destroying an innocent woman's livelihood as collateral cruelty along the way. He thought of Elena kneeling on his marble floor. He thought of Sophia's terrified voice cutting through the ballroom. He thought of his mother, laughing more in the last 2 months than she had in the 2 years prior, because a woman with nothing to gain from kindness had given it freely anyway. He closed the folder and sat in the dark of his study for a long time, and when he finally stood, something in his posture had changed, not fury exactly, though there was plenty of that. Clarity. He knew now exactly what needed to happen, and exactly who deserved to be standing in the room when it did. The Hale Foundation's annual charity dinner, scheduled 2 weeks later, drew nearly the same guest list as the engagement gala. The same ballroom, the same white roses replaced with fresh ones, the same 300 pairs of eyes that had watched Elena forced to her knees now settling into their seats for another lavish Hale evening. Vanessa arrived radiant, confident, utterly unaware that the folder locked in Daniel's study had already rewritten the entire trajectory of her evening. Daniel waited until after dinner, until the room had settled into the comfortable murmur of coffee and dessert, before rising to take the small stage usually reserved for the Foundation's annual remarks. "Before we discuss tonight's cause," he began, his voice calm in a way that somehow silenced the room faster than any shout could have, "I want to address something that happened in this exact space several weeks ago. Many of you were here for it." Vanessa's smile flickered, uncertain. "A member of my staff, a woman who has, in the 6 months she's worked in my home, shown more genuine character than nearly anyone I've met in the previous 45 years of my life, was forced to her knees in this room and publicly humiliated. I stood 3 feet away and said nothing. That failure is mine, and I've spent every day since trying to understand why I let it happen." A ripple moved through the crowd. Vanessa's hand found the stem of her wineglass, gripping it hard enough to whiten her knuckles. "What I've since learned," Daniel continued, "is that the humiliation wasn't an isolated moment of poor temper. It was the culmination of a deliberate campaign, staged accidents, falsified complaints to a 6-year-old school, financial sabotage, all aimed at destroying the livelihood of a widowed single mother who had done nothing but her job, and do it with more grace than most people manage in comfortable circumstances." "Daniel." Vanessa's voice cut across the room, brittle with panic beneath its practiced calm. "This isn't the place." "You're right," Daniel said, turning to face her directly for the first time. "The place would have been 8 months ago, before I proposed to a woman whose entire fortune, whose entire family history, has been fabricated for the last 4 years to secure exactly this kind of arrangement." The gasp that moved through the ballroom was audible, physical, a wave breaking against the walls. "I also know," Daniel continued, quieter now but no less devastating, "about Preston. About the messages. About the plan to marry me and wait him out. I won't read them aloud. There's no need to humiliate anyone in this room the way you humiliated someone in this exact spot weeks ago. That's not who I want to be." Vanessa's face had drained of color, her carefully constructed composure cracking in real time in front of the very society she'd spent years courting. "This engagement is over," Daniel said simply. "You have until tomorrow morning to remove your belongings from my home. And Vanessa," he paused, and for the first time his voice carried something almost gentle, almost sad, "I hope, genuinely, that you find whatever it is you're actually looking for. I don't think it was ever me." He turned then, scanning the crowd until he found her, Elena, who had been asked, at Daniel's personal request, to attend the dinner not as staff but as a guest, seated quietly near the back in a modest navy dress, Sophia asleep against her arm in a chair beside her. "I'd like to introduce someone," Daniel said, his voice steadying into something warmer as 300 faces turned to find her. "Elena Cruz has worked in my home for 6 months. She has shown more integrity in that time than I have witnessed from most people I've known my entire life, and she deserves, at minimum, the dignity this room failed to give her weeks ago." Elena rose slowly, Sophia stirring awake beside her, and for one long, suspended moment the entire ballroom that had once watched her kneel now stood, unprompted, in a slow ripple of applause that built until it filled every corner of the room. Vanessa Kingsley walked out alone, the click of her heels swallowed entirely by the sound. The weeks that followed unfolded with a gentleness Elena hadn't dared to expect from a life that had rarely offered her any. Mrs. Whitcomb, mortified she hadn't caught what was happening under her own supervision, personally apologized to Elena and, at Daniel's insistence, promoted her to household manager, a role with real authority, better pay, and hours that finally, reliably, let her be at Sophia's bus stop every single afternoon. The garden jar on top of the refrigerator filled faster than Elena had ever imagined it could. She kept it anyway, long after Sophia started at Brookfield Elementary with her reading garden and her art program, because some things you keep not out of necessity but out of memory, a reminder of exactly how hard she'd fought for something that had, for a while, seemed impossibly out of reach. Daniel's mother, thriving in the steady presence of a friendship that had never once been about obligation, began calling Elena family without any hesitation at all, and no one in the house corrected her. Daniel and Elena's relationship deepened slowly, without spectacle. Dinners that started as simple check-ins about the estate and stretched into hours of conversation neither of them planned on. Walks through the garden with Sophia running ahead, collecting acorns in the pockets of a coat Daniel had, without being asked, quietly ensured was warm enough for the coming winter. "I'm not looking for someone to rescue me," Elena told him plainly one evening, months after the dinner, unwilling to let old wounds go unaddressed simply because things had gotten easier. "I need you to know that. I've rescued myself more than once." "I know," Daniel said. "I'm not offering rescue. I'm offering partnership, if you'll have it, and I'll wait as long as it takes for you to trust that's actually what this is." She did have it, eventually, on her own timeline, in her own way, not because a billionaire had swept in to fix her life, but because two people who had each learned, in very different ways, what it cost to stay silent when silence was easiest, chose instead to build something honest together. Sophia, for her part, needed no convincing at all. She'd decided months earlier, somewhere between the library and the garden, that Daniel was simply hers now, in the uncomplicated way children claim the people who show up for them consistently, and she informed him of this fact with total confidence one afternoon while showing him a drawing of the three of them standing in front of a house with an enormous, lopsided sun overhead. "That's us," she said, pointing. "You're the tall one." Daniel kept that drawing framed in his study for the rest of his life. A year after the night a bowl hit a marble floor, the Hale estate hosted another gala. Smaller this time, warmer, filled with people who actually mattered rather than people who simply needed to be seen. Elena stood at the center of it, not in a maid's uniform this time, but in a simple ivory dress, Daniel's ring on her finger, Sophia twirling nearby in a dress she'd picked out herself, insisting it was fancy enough for the whole family now. Mrs. Hale, steadier on her feet than she'd been in years, raised her glass from her wheelchair at the edge of the room and said, loud enough for half the ballroom to hear, "To the woman who taught my son that character was never about the size of someone's house, it was about the size of their heart." Elena thought, standing there, of every quiet humiliation she'd swallowed over the years without complaint, every night she'd counted coins at a kitchen table by herself, every moment she'd believed dignity was something you protected silently and never expected anyone else to notice. She'd been wrong about one part of that. Dignity didn't need to be loud to matter. But sometimes, it turned out, the right person noticed anyway. Not because they were owed anything, not because it was convenient, but because genuine character has a way of being visible even to those who've spent too long looking away. What Vanessa Kingsley never understood, in all her calculations and careful cruelty, was that the woman she'd forced to her knees had never actually lost anything that mattered. Not her dignity. Not her daughter's trust. Not the quiet, unglamorous decency that had carried Elena through the hardest years of her life. What Vanessa lost was everything she'd built on lies, unraveled in a single evening because she'd underestimated the cost of underestimating someone. And what Daniel Hale learned, standing frozen on a marble floor and then spending months making it right, was this: silence in the face of cruelty is its own kind of betrayal, no matter how much money or power surrounds you, and the truest measure of a person isn't how they treat those who can benefit them, but how they treat those who, by every calculation the world teaches us to make, supposedly can't. Some people spend their whole lives collecting things they believe will define them. Elena Cruz never collected anything but the people who deserved her, and in the end, that turned out to be the only fortune that ever truly mattered.